Dobry den, ahoy, that's good day and hello in Czech. Why? Because today we're discussing our experiences at Radiodays Europe in Prague.
Special thanks to our partners for making Sounds Profitable possible. Check them out by going to soundsprofitable.com and clicking on their logos in the articles.
Welcome to the Sounds Profitable podcast. I'm Arielle Nissenblatt. I'm with Bryan and Tom discussing Radiodays Europe today. Full disclosure, we were going to have this conversation live at Radiodays in March, but the event was packed and we were too busy schmoozing to get away to record. So here we are. Today, we're chatting about the following topics. What was Radiodays Europe like? What were some of the sessions or conversations that stood out to us? And what events you can find us at in the future? We'll get into all of that and much more very shortly. But first, Tom and Bryan, hey, how you doing?
I'm good. We're good.
Outstanding. It's springtime has finally come to Boston, so that means allergies are in full effect.
What's the weather like for you right now?
It's pretty gorgeous, actually. It's mid-50s right now. It's actually going to hit 70 this week, which that's actually, proper spring.
We're at a cold front in San Antonio right now. It's about 65 degrees. It was about 57 this morning and should get up to about 70. So, yeah, I love comparing the weather.
Stop making noises with your face, Bryan.
It's okay. It was like 90. I think my water heater went from it.
I don't know. I like talking about the weather. I think it's fine.
No, it's good. It's good. But we just celebrated Easter and Passover. My parents were here. So, my mom listening to this podcast 300 times. Thank you for visiting. But it was good. It's good. We're in April right now, which I think Tom and I have designated our slow month because I think we can get away with no travel. We have potentially one travel event, but then May we have some travel and June definitely. And then it doesn't slow down until July.
But wow. You're active and out and about today, right, Arielle? Aren't you? What are you doing today? You're doing something fun.
I am. On the day of our recording, which is Monday, the 10th of April, Lauren Pacell and I are going to Washington Square Park, and we're going to be stopping people on the street and asking them about their podcast listening habits. It's Adopt-a-Listener month, and we are trying to make some video content around that. Should be very interesting. I've never done this before. And we've printed out consent forms, and we're going to be asking people what they listen to, why they listen to it, what they think of Joe Rogan, what they think of Call Her Daddy. It's going to be right by NYU, so we feel like those are the two podcasts that people will probably be most familiar with. Should be interesting.
I'm really excited for that. What are you going to do with the content afterwards?
We hope to make TikTok-style videos, TikTok Reels, YouTube Shorts, things like that. And then also we're going to have all this anecdotal data on what people who frequent Washington Square Park are listening to. So some of the questions we plan on asking are, have you heard of a podcast? Please describe a podcast to me. What is stopping you from listening to a podcast? Things like that. So all things that I feel like are definitely within the Sounds Profitable universe of questions, especially that article that Tom had a few weeks ago at this point about the 5 questions to ask your audience. So I feel like we're asking that of the general public.
While you're in Washington Square Park, if you see my dealer, let him know. I'll see him on Thursday, and I'm good for it. Really. Thank you.
Oh, man. Okay, well, why don't we shift gears? Why don't we talk about Radio Days? So we recently all returned from Prague, Czech Republic. We were there for Radiodays Europe. It was a lot of fun. Initial reactions, please. Tom.
I love the conference. Love Prague. It was my second time in Prague. Actually, my wife Tamsin and I went to Prague for the first time on the back end of a Radio Days conference when Radio Days was in Vienna. We took the train to Prague after it. So this was our second time back in Prague, which is the most beautiful city in Europe. Just it is.
Wow.
And I love Radio Days. I've spoken and attended at Radio Days Europe for over a decade now. And it's a super useful viewpoint for an American to see because radio in America is different to radio in almost the entire world. Radio in the United States has made some very bad choices, some forced errors, some unforced errors over the past 25 years. But radio throughout the rest of the world is healthy and vibrant and popular and enjoyable and funded. And at Radio Days Europe, you get to see, the best of the best, I think, in terms of what's creative, what's innovative, in the world of programming and it's just really vibrant and fun. And as a fan of all things audio, to be able to see audio succeed at such a commercial scale in Europe it's kind of fun.
It is kind of fun. Bryan, what are your initial thoughts about Prague, about Radio Days?
So last year was my first time going to Radio Days, and it was really interesting. I mean, showing how not used to foreign travel I am, especially for work. I literally went from Copenhagen to Malmo without my passport on the train. So understanding how small geographically everything is was really exciting. But like talking to different people and realizing that I'm sitting with 5-10 people and none of them are from the same country. All of them have similar experiences with audio, but their country handles it differently. How much people listen to radio, how little advertising plays into their life. Sometimes I honestly felt like I was on display because I could talk about advertising, which for a lot of these people didn't fit into what they were digging into. So it was a curiosity instead of a requirement like it is for us. But I want to pay you a compliment. I think that anytime that I was walking around, it was very easy to find like an older guy in radio and audio. But if I saw you, you were surrounded by a younger crowd of diverse individuals, and I would sit with you and I would hear the most interesting stories. These were people that had titles that I think were, I was surprised. Some of them were young, like way younger than me, that had powerful titles at amazing companies and were there to learn for all of audio, for podcasting, for radio too. And you kept cultivating a group of people that were really interested in learning about radio, sharing what they knew, and just meeting as many people as possible. I honestly think I got the most benefit of meeting new people from hanging out with you.
Oh, first day of the conference, which was the podcast summit day. There was a podcast summit, a data summit, and then a radio youth summit. There were a few different summits going on. I was involved in the podcast summit. I made a girl gang. So me and like a bunch of young women were hanging out, and it was a lot of fun, and we were supporting each other. And you're right that there were a lot of older white men there, and it can be intimidating to approach groups of older white men. So we were like, you know what, let's stick together. Let's make some friends. Let's go around the expo hall floor and chat and schmooze and try to make a name for ourselves. And we definitely had a lot of fun with that. And thank you for that, Bryan.
What about you? So the event was split into two sections, right? We had the podcast day, well, for us, but like you said, the other tracks, and then the core radio. Like, where did you find the most interest on your end? Like for you interacting with new people or learning?
So I went to VidCon last June in Los Angeles. And what I found interesting about VidCon was that the most prevalent category of vendor was get creators paid. And here at Radio Days, the most prevalent category of vendors was, here's how to track the traffic coming to your radio station. And that was very interesting to me as somebody who's used to going to podcast conferences, right? Like there, I think the most prevalent category of vendors is hosting sites, probably. Hosting sites, or maybe get creators paid or analytics or something like that. But it's really interesting to go to a radio first conference. Obviously, radio is in the title of Radio Days Europe. So that stood out to me. And it definitely feels like a lot of the radio first companies that were in the expo hall are curious about podcasting, but don't really know what the future of it is. And there's definitely still, like Tom said, a huge market going on with radio in Europe. But a lot of the people that I was hanging out with are people who are making audio on demand. And they were curious about analytics. They were curious about Tom's research. They were curious about, there were a lot of sessions on what does the youth want? What does Gen Z want to listen to?
Those were packed based on pictures, like all of that, which is really exciting because I feel like here it's easy to dismiss, as Tom's been yelling out forever, Gen Z and, 55 plus, really easy to dismiss them in education. But those were way more attended than any other session.
Absolutely. They were huge. I think a lot of people are wondering, how do we make programming that attracts these people? And it definitely was reflected in the attendance. I wanted to ask you two a question, which is why, and you talk about this a lot when it comes to going to events that are not specifically podcast related, but why was it important for Sounds Profitable to be at this event specifically, Europe, and then also something with radio in the title?
Well, I'll take a stab at that, especially with Radio Days Europe. I think podcasting, I think, is seen by the radio industry in the United States differently than it is seen by the radio, the radio industrial complex throughout Europe. I think in the United States, I think there's a real desire to get into podcasting because there's an economic need to diversify as reach and listening to commercial radio continues to decline in the U.S. There's some real financial pressures on American radio stations to diversify, to create content in on-demand media, and so they are reaching for it, kind of coming out of struggle in some cases, trying to diversify their revenue streams from a position of need. Right in Europe, the radio stations there, compared to American radio stations, are kind of fat and happy. The markets are not over-radioed, right? There's over 100 FM stations in New York. There's no need of that. You don't see that in major European capitals. There's a much smaller number of radio stations kind of super serving large chunks of the population. They spend a lot more money on content. And the position there, I think, is, well, why do we need podcasting? Will that not take away from what we're doing in radio? And so there's almost this kind of valley between the needs of American radio companies and European radio companies. And to answer your question, I think it was important for us to be there to continue to promote the space and the importance of the space and to where everything is going, because European broadcasters are in a position right now, I think, to make significant investments, significant commitments to product, to content, to technology. And that's going to make the space bigger and better for all of us. So I think as much as anything, it was important for us to be cheerleaders for the space, to talk about how important it is and how important it is for their future, even as they're continuing to enjoy, enormous cash flow or ratings in the case of state broadcasters from the radio side.
Yeah, something that stood out to me, just a small sort of language difference between the US and Europe, is that a lot of people were referring to presenters. We don't really call folks presenters here. We call them hosts. So that was just something that stood out to me. And a lot of the people that I was hanging out with were talking about presenters. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? So I gained a little bit of cultural competency by being at this event. Are there any other small things like that stood out to you, Tom and Bryan?
I don't know anything about radio. Like everything I've learned.
That stood out to you.
No, but like how open these people are with the conversations. I mean, I desperately would kill for a podcast about what public radio life is like in the US. Like everybody who has had their foot in it to some degree has like a joke about it or like a dead stare in their eye if they weren't happy with it. And like, I can't relate to it. Like I came from digital into podcasting, audio. This is my first time in audio. So when I'm around people who are happy about it and who want to learn and who believe truly that they can continue the growth or hold steady versus like they're on a sinking ship, which sometimes it feels like in the US, that's like, they're just like, we can't stop it. And it's like, you really could if you focused on it. It's exciting. It's because these people want to educate, because every person they reach out to, just like every person we reach out to in podcasting, is someone who's an evangelist, someone who gets in the car and thinks, you know what, I'm not going to immediately connect to my Bluetooth player and listen to a podcast. I'm going to see what's on the radio. I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to understand and learn more. And I'm really thankful for that. We're not going to the NAB, which is either this week or next. I think it's next week.
It's on the 15th of April.
Yeah, I've lost track of time or dimensions at this point. But because the NAB feels to me like the same people are going to meet at Podcast Movement and all the other podcast events, and they're trying to be across all of audio, and I'm very happy for them there. But I don't think I'm going to learn. We went to this event and we got to teach people what our expertise was, and we got to learn a lot. Yeah. Every conversation was learning.
And I went to some sessions and I learned a lot. Go ahead, Tom.
I want to say one other thing about what makes the Radio Days event in Europe really special. And I know there's going to be another Radio Days event, Radio Days North America in Toronto in June, which we're also going to attend. The largest broadcasters in Europe are actually the state broadcasters. And, they're not like how we think of public radio in the United States. There actually is no state broadcaster in the United States. There are local public radio stations. They may buy content from NPR and things like that, but they're not operated by a state broadcaster like the BBC. So there's no analog to that in the States. But the state broadcasters in all of these European countries are well-funded, They are able to attract young talent. They're able to attract great presenters, spend money on formats and things like that. So what you get there are two things. Number one, so many people are not in the commercial space, so they're more free to talk about what's working and what isn't working. And number two, they don't generally compete with each other, right? The head of public radio in Denmark doesn't compete with the head of public radio in Austria. And again, public radio in these countries plays popular music. It has entertainment features. It's not, This Week in Washington. You know what I mean? It's radio for the people. So there's a collegiality to this conference that I really enjoy, where people do share what they have learned. They do share what works and what doesn't work. And I think things have gotten fairly competitive in the podcasting space in America. People are kind of fighting over share instead of trying to make the pie bigger, which is certainly what we're focused on.
Although moving off of radio, but still staying in Europe, I went to Vienna after Prague for a few days, and somebody messaged me on Instagram after they attended my talk at Radio Days, and they said, "Loved your talk. I would love to chat with you at some point down in the future about marketing and growth." And I was like, great. And then I clicked on their profile and I saw that they were based in Vienna. So I was like, let's get together when I'm in Vienna. So I ended up spending a lot of time with a company called Oh Wow, which is they do a lot of German language, sometimes branded, sometimes not branded, programming podcasts, on-demand audio in Vienna for the German market, for the German-speaking market. And what they kept telling me, I had a lovely time there. I just want to shout them out because they invited me to actually do their Monday morning inspirational talk to, I went to the office, had a really great time, to their staff. And I actually helped onboard a new hire, which was really cool. Gave them an insight into the wider world of the podcast space. And what they kept telling me was that it feels like Europe, the podcast space in Europe, is actually sort of competitive, and that the podcast space in the US feels less competitive, more collaborative. So I don't know where that's coming from, and it might just be a perception thing, but I definitely took that to heart, and it's sticking with me, is that I do feel like most people in the podcast space in the US understand that in order to grow, we have to share audiences. And I do hope that sentiment trickles to Europe as well, because it is true that, in order for this show to grow, it would be great if it got a promo read on DigiDay, for example, and then vice versa. So yeah, just another note. I'm just sharing my findings about my European podcast adventures. I love, whenever I go to a new city, I like to find out who the podcast people are and just hang out with them. It's the best way.
I love that you do that. Tom, related to that, though, this is a question that gets asked to me as not a researcher working with yourself, an expert researcher. We look at the U.S., it is an overwhelming majority of podcast consumption. It's an overwhelming majority of podcast advertising consumption. U.S. is still very heavy on advertising and all that. It's very easy for us to do our research there because it is the largest place. If we were to go into other areas to do that, we might explore the UK, we might explore Australia. Those are the places that I think stand out as in the top 5 that we go to next. But on my end, when I look at Europe and I look at the languages, I'm often asked when we present research, how do we apply this to our country? Or could this work for all of Europe? Because a lot of people, like you said, sharing audience is interesting, and a lot of people speak English. But when you're in a default mode and you're, from one country versus another, are you going to want to listen to something in English if it's not professional, if it's not a movie theater, if it's not on Netflix? I guess what I'm asking is, how do we look at a geographical area that's as big as the United States, but has numerous different languages and habits and cultures? And how do we apply research to that, or how do we apply listener share to that? What can we do?
Well, it's the one thing you can't do is take the whole continent as a piece. And yeah, they're all, many of them are part of the EU, true. But, reactions, you mentioned English content. English content does much better in Sweden than it's going to do in France. English content is not going to do well in France. It's also not going to do well in Germany. And there's another lever that's different from country to country, and that is the popularity and the demand for news and information and spoken word content. The United States, comparatively, does not have a great demand, believe it or not, for news and information and spoken word content. So we're always sort of fighting against that kind of cap a little bit. But in a country like Germany, the average German just craves lots and lots of news and information. And even the music stations there will feature 5 or 10 minutes of news every hour. So a lot of the needs that people have for spoken word content are actually met by radio, because that kind of content is popular, and radio is designed to serve popular content to mass numbers of people. So, and consequently, I think you see podcasting lagging a little bit in Germany. I don't think that's a permanent lag. I think more content will be explored and more avenues will be opened up. But, there's different attitudes about news and information. There's different attitudes about native spoken language, and then some other cultural differences. You really can't take any one country to be representative of the entire EU.
Yeah, and that's tough, because as we've been working really hard on the research, right, and everything that we're doing to be as applicable as possible, and so being able to extend it to specific countries. And again, my goal wasn't to just categorize all the EU, but to show like the fallacy in that, right? But it's just tough. We're busting our butts working with great partners like Signal Hill to figure out the most economical way to provide the best data that's actionable and quickly available. And that's great. But if you had to break it down to 10 countries, I don't know who could do that, because I don't know. You need more people to action on it. Like, we've been doing such great research. And by the way, please check out the research on the site. It's freely available. We don't even ask for your email for it, and use it. Our goal is for you to take that and actively use that to build your business, to win more revenue, to win more contracts, to grow podcasting overall. But the amount of buy-in you need in each country, because each country is independent, it gets tough. It's not insurmountable, but it's overwhelming. And I think this is why it's easy to just focus on the US or Australia or the UK.
Let's talk a little bit now about how your research was received at Radio Days. So, Tom, you presented at Radio Days a few times. Tell me about the presentations that you gave, and also you presented the same research in the US just a few weeks before. So I'm curious about the reception and how it differed.
Yeah, I think the reception in both situations was great, because
you mean no one was like, "Ew, Tom sucks"?
Not in front of me. I'm sure that happens in corners of the conference. But I think in regardless of whether it was presented in the U.S. or in Europe, it was kind of new information. It was a comparative study of the effectiveness of advertising across two broadcast media, radio and linear television, which, the former certainly very relevant to the people at Radio Days Europe, and on-demand media, in this case, podcasting, and kind of look at how they behave differently. The study was called "The Medium Moves the Message." And I think in both cases, the kind of salient thing, whether you're in commercial podcasting or as a public broadcaster into podcasting, that mattered to both audiences was just how young the podcast audience is compared to the broadcast audience, and B, just how increasingly exclusive and additive that audience is compared to a broadcast audience. So that if you want to reach 18 to 34s in America, if you want to reach 18 to 34s in some of the bigger podcasting countries in Europe, sometimes you're not going to be able to reach them at all with broadcast radio or broadcast TV. And that's a message, I think, that resonated in both Europe and America. So, I tried to pick and choose things from the greater study that would be more applicable in Europe. I think I did okay. And in the session that I presented that research in, there was another wonderful presentation from Radio Denmark on some research they did also on demographics and content choices. And I've written away to Peter Nigel, who is the organizer and head of Radio Days Europe, but also the lead researcher for DR, Denmark Radio, to see if we can share that and kind of bring that to our audience, because I think it's applicable here as well. So great insights all around.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for the recap. I think I have seen the research now in 3 different places, which has been really cool to hear how you iterate on your talking points and how the questions that are asked of you. So it's been a privilege to hear it in different places, and the jokes that you make in the different places. I love comparing it. So thank you for sharing that. What is next for the Sounds Profitable international travel schedule, boys?
I think it's a lot national to start, but I actually wrote down the list here. So we have May 11th is the IAB podcast upfronts, which we're sponsoring in a small part. And hopefully Tom will be presenting some research there. We've had some really good conversations with them about Tom helping close out their research presentation. With a podcast show London, which is the 24th and 25th, but the Sounds Profitable Partner event is going to be on the 23rd. And that's from 2 to 6 p.m. That's open to all of our partners. We do our quarterly events. We don't sell tickets to them. We now have 130 partners. We go out of our way to get as many buy-side people there as possible. And Tom's going to be presenting the preview for our Q2 research, which we're really, really excited about. Then we have the Ad Monsters Ops event, which is in New York on June 5th, and Tom will be presenting there, either Media Moves the Message or the latest research, depending on which one they're interested in. And then I think 3 days later, we're flying out to Radio Days North America in Toronto, and that's June 8th. And I know that I'm ending June with a trip to Brussels, thanks to the team at EGTA, who I met at Radio Days Europe last year and continued a great conversation with this year. And it's going to be a smaller event all about, the use of podcasting and ad tech tools in a European market. And Tom, you have some European travel later in the year, though.
I've got the Radio Days country-specific equivalents for Denmark and Sweden happening in the same week. So I'm going to make a Scandinavian festival out of that. And then later this week, actually, I'm doing a presentation for the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers, to talk about the media moves the message and why advertisers need to invest in podcasting for not just middle and lower funnel, but also upper funnel reach. I'm going to talk about that in this week's Data Decoded, actually, which I think will come out Wednesday or Thursday. I don't know which, but at some point.
What is Data Decoded for folks who don't know what that is?
Data Decoded is our generally weekly, very short video series. I try to keep it to 5 minutes, where I pick apart one new data point or piece of information that's just come out in podcasting and expand it into how you can actually make use of it. Try to put some context into what just looks like a stat on a page. So it's just 5 quick minutes. Our own Gavin Gaddis does an amazing job editing it into something far more creative than I would have mustered. So it is one of the least painful 5-minute things you can watch this week.
We will link to Data Decoded, the YouTube channel, in the show notes of this episode. And I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for recapping Radio Days with me. It's always great to... There's so much that goes on at these events. It's important to chat with other people and share our takeaways and figure out how to move forward from there and how to take these amazing insights and put them into actionable next steps. If you were at Radio Days Europe, we'd love to know what you thought of the event. And also, big shout out to the event organizers for putting together such a lovely week of learning, connections, and fun. It was really fun to hang out in Prague. Thank you to Bryan and Tom for joining me to discuss. Listeners, we would love to know your thoughts on our coverage of this event. I'm on Twitter at ReThisAndThat. Bryan is at Bryan Barletta. Tom is at Webby2001. And Sounds Profitable is at SoundsProfNews. We're also on LinkedIn. Just search for Sounds Profitable.
And if you want to send us an email, you can reach us at podcast. That's what this is. Podcast at soundsprofitable.com.
This episode was recorded using Squadcast.fm. It's the best way to record remotely. You can try it out yourself for a 7-day free trial by going to Squadcast.fm.
To access our articles, product deep dives, the Podscape, our research, and more, head to soundsprofitable.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sounds Profitable Podcast with me, Bryan Barletta.
Me, Tom Webster.
And me, Arielle Nissenblatt.
This episode is put together using Spooler and edited by Gavin Gaddis. Sounds Profitable Podcast is hosted on Art19.